This is Barbara Johns. I'm an art historian, author, and former museum curator. My work for the past 15 years has focused on Issei, or immigrant generation Japanese American artists. This is the second of 3 accounts of Seattle Issei artists who were well known before the war. All were incarcerated at Minidoka and left records of their experience. Takuichi Fujii, whose painting is at left, Takuichi Fujii in the center, and Kenjiro Nomura at the right. Their artwork and words give unique insight into their experience, especially as an Issei perspective. This week is about Takuichi Fujii. My introduction to Fujii's trove of wartime artwork was wonderfully serendipitous. Although I knew his paintings in the 1930s, there was virtually no record of his activity or whereabouts after 1941, other than the fact of his wartime incarceration. I was beginning a dissertation, of the 3 artists' work in the 1930s, thinking that I would have only tidbits of information about Fujii, when, out of the blue, I was introduced online to his grandson and heir, Sandy Kita. Sandy, a scholar of Japanese art, was completing the translation of his grandfather's diary. Sandy and his wife Terry live in the East Coast, and I in the West, but I had research to do in Washington, D.C., near their home. When we met, they showed me Fujii's wartime diary, some 150 watercolors, drawings, oil paintings, and wood carvings from the war years, and later work extending to the end of the artist's life. None of it had been seen outside the family. Fujii was born in Hiroshima, Japan in 1891. Within days of his 15th birthday, he boarded a ship for Seattle, where he was to meet his father and brother. His father and older brother returned to Japan, but Fujii stayed and worked his way to become a fish merchant. He married and became the father of 2 daughters. He also became an artist, although there was no record of how or when, but by 1930 his paintings began to receive artistic recognition. Here are 2 paintings from the 1930s, one a small landscape in Seattle's Nihonmachi, the other a landscape picturing the Rock Island Dam in central Washington shortly after its completion. The dam was the first one constructed on the Columbia River, a major public works project in the middle of the Depression. And here is a lovely portrait of one of his daughters as a high school student. But with the onset of war and orders for the mass exclusion of ethnic Japanese from the West Coast, Fujii and his family were sent to the so-called Puyallup Assembly Center on the Washington State Fairgrounds, 30 miles south of Seattle. At Puyallup, Fujii began an illustrated diary, what the historian Roger Daniels has called the most remarkable document created by a Japanese American prisoner during the wartime incarceration. The diary is a small single volume, 384 pages of text and image that extend from the family's forced removal to the closing of Minidoka 3.5 years later. Recently, a generous donor purchased the diary on behalf of the Wing Luke Museum, assuring that it will be held in public trust. The texts are sometimes a brief label, others are longer, some in anguish, some in wry understatement. This entry recalls the family's last night in Seattle. It's one of the longest and the only one he titled. It reads, "An evening of reluctance. Finally, tomorrow, we must say farewell to this house in which we have become so accustomed. Naked, having disposed of our shop, furniture, everything, in a muddle we packed only the absolute minimum of personal belongings, clothing, and bedding. Our home, which is now empty, feels lonely and cold in the dim light. Since we had no bed, we got out our coats and, making a temporary bed, slept together like sardines in a can. But because we couldn't sleep, we were up before dawn. Having taken our last breakfast, We waited for the time to pass. All my family looked anxious. He pictures their arrival at Puyallup and the family's move into their single-room barrack. On the very next page, he looks out the barrack's one window. He describes the fence, the machine gun, and the soldiers, and mourns, when war comes, do people become horrible like this? Thinking about that, I felt wretched. Although none of the diary's entries is dated, the sequence and repetition of images reveal the impact of events and conditions. The first pages of Puyallup show in quick sequence the dirty, dirty shower, the communal latrine, and the long lines. Time and again, he pictures the means of confinement, the fence, the guard towers, and the soldiers. He specifies his viewpoint as if giving testimony. One reads, for example, in the north, looking in the direction of the front gate from the back. It's interesting to compare his scenes of Puyallup with Nomura's, which you may have seen in last week's presentation. In this colorful composition, Nomura pictures young people socializing by the main gate. Fujii's, by contrast, is much starker. While part of the difference may be in the artist's disposition, Fujii's drawing is among the first ones he made at Puyallup, when the shock of incarceration was most severe. Nomura's view is later, when the Nikki have begun to adapt to the new conditions in which they must live. Fujii pictures a tremendous range of daily activities, and in the sequence of images subtly compares the activities and manner of the different generations. He pictures the departure from Puyallup, his first glimpse of Minidoka as he peers over the bus driver's shoulder, and the family moving into their barrack at night. After posting his nameplate outside the door, he steps back to look and remarks, "Indeed, this is an odd door. The lock is on the outside. I see that this relocation center is a prison." Here, as in other examples, the text and image clarify and intensify one another. We need both to fully grasp the meaning. The diary continues with the type of sights and activities he pictured at Puyallup, and toward the end are doubled, 2 to a page. Fujii was among those who stayed at Minidoka until the bitter end, fearful of what lay ahead after having lost nearly everything. The last 10 pages of the diary have no text, but are eloquent testimony to the acute anxiety of those who remain. In the upper right, the calendar on the wall reads October 2nd, the day that Fujii and his wife left Minidoka. Fujii produced dozens of watercolors related to the diary, as in these of Puyallup. Sometimes there's more than one version, and in the repetition we can imagine the weight that the subject must have carried for Fujii. This diary page and 3 watercolors show the same boundary sign bearing orders from General John DeWitt, the commanding officer of the Western Defense Zone. The painting at center top, although very small, is the only one among all his wartime work where Fujii signed his name. Elsewhere, he pictures the house in the background, alone. It was the view from his barrack window and represents a potent symbol of freedom on the other side of the fence. These are among many paintings of Minidoka, some related to the diary, and others are new compositions. Here, the comparable diary images again specify the location and assert his presence and witness. He tells us this is the barbed wire around Block 24, and on the right, Block 19, seen from the place where I live. His choices of buildings and infrastructure are usually those weighted with meaning, such as the headquarters of the Army Military Police above. Here also is a sandstorm that he tells us darkens the day, and a lively inverted self-portrait, which puts us as viewers in his place as witness. Some contain a distinct narrative character. These postcard-sized paintings show pounding mochi for the first New Year's celebration, and on the right, Fujii and his wife surprised by a rattlesnake. The diary tells us he was bitten and hospitalized. He began to experiment with a wide range of abstract styles. Here is the fence, again, the one around Block 24, in a montage of camp objects and landmarks. 44 of the largest watercolors were stored in this handmade portfolio. On the cover, he has taped a small drawing of Seattle, the city that had been his home, and for him, had gone up in flames. None of the watercolor work is dated, and it's not clear that all of the watercolors were painted during the war. Some may have been painted in later years as he reflected on his experience. Look carefully at the painting on the right, and you'll see the portfolio on his desk, along with a wastebasket of discarded work. And here, in the only such instances, he has signed his work with a rice bowl, a stamp of his Japanese heritage. Fujii was widely known as one of the camp's artists. If you're familiar with the Minidoka Interlude, you've already seen some of his work, for he was its illustrator. On the left end page is Minidoka, and on the right, Puyallup. Here again is the sign bearing DeWitt's orders. After leaving Minidoka, Fujii and his wife moved briefly to Ogden, Utah, where their older daughter and her husband were working, and by the late 1940s, they moved to Chicago, where once again the entire family was reunited. It soon included 2 grandsons. Note the little boy in the cowboy hat. Fujii continued to paint in both abstract and realist styles. In the last years of his life, he produced a series of large, bold, black and white abstractions. He died in 1964. 3 generations of his family have carefully stored his artwork: his widow, his daughter, and his grandson. I've had the exceptionally rewarding opportunity to bring Fujii's accomplishment to public attention for the first time, in my book, published in 2017, and in a traveling exhibition that is touring nationally until 2025. Here is Fujii's grandson, Sandy Kita, that little boy in the cowboy hat, at the opening of the exhibition at the Washington State History Museum. Following the positive response to the book and the exhibition, the University of Washington Press will publish Fujii's entire diary, with Sandy's translation and my annotation. If you'd like to see the exhibition, I hope you'll encourage your local museum to host it. Thanks very much.